Welcome to Cellar Door Skeptics. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We are live with the second part of our Insurrection discussion with Professor Historian Liam O'Mara. How are you tonight, sir?
Oh, good. I mean, short of the little technical glitches, but
Mhm.
rocking on as always.
Yeah, so what I wanted to do is have Liam back on so that we could have a conversation with him to talk about a little bit more about insurrection, kind of get into some of the history and some of the other parts of the world that we didn't get to cover last time, and have a good conversation around um maybe some of the different variables. With that being said, how are you all this week? It's been a pretty busy week for me, so I don't know about you guys. I spent literally the last 7 days, all but one day, streaming 4 hours a day for my other podcast, Planning Phase Syndicate, because we had like some championship type X-Wing miniatures games going on. So I spent many hours just streaming, pretty much like 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock, roughly almost every night.
So you're saying your children have been neglected? That's what we're talking.
Well, my children are older. They
I
aren't
know.
like yours, so they don't require
Oh.
the attention. And B, we get the break. I get breaks in between, so I have like an hour to an hour and a half in between each stream. So we would stream, stop, go eat dinner, get the kids ready, come back, stream, stop, go get the kids, tell them to go night. But yes, pretty much they spent a lot of time on their iPads this week.
I don't know.
Wow, that must have been hell for them.
I had a, I called it an Instagram weekend. I just like my wife had a bunch of stuff going on. So if you were a fan of our Instagram, I've just been posting all kinds of pictures and videos and stuff of just like one of the things that like is fun is to talk about humanizing some of these secular communities and the non-belief communities and the political communities and the left communities and all that kind of stuff is like having your families and what you do for fun. And like I really love cooking. I like learning about cooking, and I'm trying to get my daughters more involved, and we garden and we're doing that kind of stuff. And like it just that was my weekend. Was just my wife had photo shoots and she was busy, and her business is starting to grow a little bit, which is awesome, and just a good weekend. So like I didn't rest up much, doing a lot of stuff, but we've been getting rain really hard. I don't know if you guys all got that much rain. I'm guessing Keith didn't because he's on fire. But
Oh,
I got about 6 inches of rain in the last 2 weeks. So I mean, we got so much water, we don't know what to do with it. And other parts of the world are so dry that if you sneeze, it starts a tree on fire. So there's a bunch of
they're
things going on, and I don't know. It's just we were just spending a lot of time outside and having fun in the rain, and it was just a good weekend.
yes, we would love rain. Actually, in Calgary, I guess last week there was a small grass fire that was sparked by a train in a neighborhood I used to live in. That they evacuated partially, but yeah, there's a good chunk of BC that British Columbia, so our west coast, that's currently on fire. And this happens pretty much every summer. We've come to expect this, but it never used to be this bad. I mean, it's like this whole global warming thing has some real merit to it. And we basically, because of our position to the mountains, my city basically, I haven't seen blue sky in 3 or 4 days. It's been sunny, it's been hot. Um, but there's so much smoke, it's literally blocking out the sun, and that's all I can smell. Our air quality was so bad, there have actually been air quality warnings put out. A few years ago, our air quality was actually worse than pretty much anywhere in China. It was that bad, and those are the places like with the heavy pollution and whatnot. That's how much smoke had blown in through our city. So yeah, if we could get some rain here, that might pull some of this garbage out of the air, make our air a little fresher. That would be just great. Otherwise, I am very, very warm from working all day in the sun. So those of you who are watching the live stream and you notice I look pink and disheveled, I am both.
Sounds like the movie Highlander 2: The Quickening, when they blacken out the sky and Christopher Lambert fights everybody with swords. I'm guessing that's what Calgary's like right now. It's just people running around cutting off heads with swords. That
I
close?
I I I I don't know, but I want it to be that way now because at least that would be exciting.
Yeah.
Oh,
What about you,
Christ.
Liam? What's your life like out there right now?
In terms of weather, it's been insanely hot lately. So that's been fun. But I think more of that probably has to do with the lousy insulation of the house and the way it just sort of cooks me inside. Because it's actually not that bad at all when I go out. But yeah, it is still kind of unseasonable, at least in terms of the longer term. You mentioned the changes over because of global warming, which is a real thing. I mean, you look at if you go back 30 years and look at temperature averages in this area, it's 15 to 20 degrees hotter consistently than it was then in the same seasons. And that's a pretty big difference for, so the heat waves are much worse. I mean, the averages, have gone up a little bit, but when you actually have a period of heat waves, it is considerably hotter than it ever was before.
What did I read? It was -5 to -6 degrees cooler the last global ice age on average for the planet, and there was a mile of ice on top of Chicago.
Yeah.
So that's a nice perspective.
Yeah, let's
Oh,
I don't know, let's
five
get some
degrees.
of that. I pull a little bit of that forward.
Mm-hmm.
But
Oh,
yeah, what worries
goodness.
me, I guess, the most, and you're already seeing this in fires in Northern California, in Washington, in BC. Uh, the fire seasons are just getting worse and worse. I mean, before this year, the last 4 years, 3 out of those 4 years, I was directly threatened by the fire,
Jesus.
which is getting ridiculous. And when they get to where they're like a block from your house and you're just sitting there watching the infernos, this is nice.
That's
I've
insane.
So,
been
so
under that
don't you leave? Like, isn't it like you leave or no?
If I have to, it's sort of like at the last possible minute because you want to keep, hosing stuff off and worrying about stuff. And there's only so much I can get out, and there's nowhere really I can go. I mean, I have too many of these, and there's, I mean, no one wants like, hey, come on over, bring all the four legs, it'll be great. So I put it off as long as I possibly can. One of those I was basically just trapped in location. If I left, they would not have let me back in. So it wasn't the point where they were forcing everyone out, but they were encouraging people to leave. And if you left, you could not come back in.
Can you get
So,
all your critters in a car and just?
I mean, I can, but I would be able to take nothing else.
Hmm,
It would be nothing but cats, dog, and before I had the tortoises. They're less of an issue now, but I
jeez.
still have 3 cats and the dog.
Yeah.
I mean, the fish will boil. I mean, I'm not taking them, but which sucks. But there's no way I'm getting a 40-gallon aquarium in my car. So, but you know,
Maybe the safest thing you could take with you in all reality. Just take 40 gallons of water in your
right?
car.
Yeah. But
Oh man,
but
I
yeah,
didn't know you were that close to the fires. That's pretty wild. We're Chris and I are pretty safe over here in the Midwest. We're the area when everybody would come with the marauders and the bloodthirsty metal helmets when they come to kill us for the Great Lakes water.
yeah, exactly. I mean, if we look at climate change projections, the Northeast and the Midwest, not much change, but the Southeast and the Southwest are pretty much fucked. So. Yeah, where I live is going to get steadily drier and steadily hotter. I mean, the drought here means that the fires just come much more often and they're much more intense.
Yep.
And I live in a forest, so go figure. If there's a fire, they have to work pretty hard to keep it away from the settled areas.
So the temperature gradient of the averages for the United States and the parts that have seen the least amount of change are the Bible Belt. Like it's insane that it's a perfect circle, right over like Kentucky, Mississippi, Missouri. It's like, why are those the places that aren't seeing anything? Because it's just confirmation bias confirming the fact. It's no big deal. We got snowballs, whatever. It's just like,
Yeah,
but
but
yeah,
the
it's bad.
predictions for the area are insane because of the high humidity in the area. When the temperature climbs a bit more with that humidity, I mean there's predictions already that within less than half a century you're going to get heat waves in the southeast that will kill any exposed mammal life. Like step
Oh,
out of the shade, drop dead from a heat stroke. And that's obviously going to kill off animal life, which is going to, ramp up, hitting tons and tons of other species. It's going to be insane. I mean,
Well, as
most days will be okay, and then you'll get a heat wave, and everyone will drop dead. So,
My neighbor just moved in from Arizona, and he was like, "Hey, let's see what the temperature is in my house." He was over. It's like 12:30 at night. It was 97 degrees in his old neighborhood in Arizona. Like,
I,
what? So,
I'm
Yeah, but
trying to.
that's not that much.
well, I mean,
it's hard
tell
to
grandma 97. Oh, it's a dry heat. Grandma's going down.
Mhm.
So,
I a couple of weeks ago, Lytton in British Columbia actually was the hottest place on the planet. I think some of you may have heard.
no
Um,
way.
I'm just trying to pull this up right now. Temperature.
I
Oops.
mean, I saw 120 something in Arizona. It's hotter than
Yeah,
that.
it was.
Mhm.
So the record was it was set last week, and it was 49.6 degrees Celsius or 121.3 Fahrenheit.
That's
Yeah.
a
So
that's a Libyan summer right there. That is not
yeah,
cool.
and that was in Canada.
Yeah.
You know, the place where everybody thinks we live in igloos and
Mhm.
have pet polar bears and stuff.
I can see it
Yeah,
now.
no.
It'll go into the books of history as the day the syrup boiled.
Yeah,
Oh,
but of
the
course
poor
there's no
Quebecois.
problem, and we shouldn't change anything at all, and we should worry first about the economy because we should protect the economy, and yeah, so
Well, yeah. Otherwise, then certain people won't keep maintaining power.
oh yeah, I mean, heaven forbid some rich people lose a little money for the I don't know kids being able to like live, you know.
Actually, be a good way to tie into starting the show. Actually, is we're talking about like really super rich people, and the concept of tonight's show is the collapse of democracy and things of that nature. So, like, I mean, the nice 15 minutes of shooting the shoot. I guess. Where did we want to take this show? Give the helm back to Chris before we all tangent off into oblivion.
Well, I think a lot of it makes sense because as we as we see experience these heat waves, and the reason I said Arizona at 100 or at 97 isn't that big deal because my buddy lived there 10 years ago, 13 years ago roughly when he went to his school, and it was 115 almost every day for like a month, you know. And he says you know, you're right. Yeah. Grandma's not going to like it. You just don't do anything. You get in your car, you go wherever you're going to go,
Yeah,
you get
summer,
home.
winter.
Yeah,
That's what I've
it's
been told.
you don't do much. But
Yeah, but when it never cools off, I mean, one thing about the deserts, and I grew up in the desert in Southern California, and have a lot of friends in Arizona, just over the border there. At night it tends to get really cold, so you have like
Yeah, I heard
really
40s.
days, and then it drops really low. I mean, Death Valley, which will fry you during the day, is often nice and chilly at night, and it's just taking forever for the temperatures to come back down, and it's worse indoors too because you can trap the heat, and then yeah, grandma's gonna fry.
I think if we look
Worst
at
recipe ever. Every
what
time.
it
Always burn it.
what this leads to, right, is at some point this is going to lead to more tempers. This is going to lead to bigger issues within our communities because people are not going to be happy about this. And if Liam's right, and in 50 years the Southeast is basically going to become uninhabitable, then where are all those people going to go? So how many people are in America? We have over 300 million, right?
75,
313 million.
375 last check that I know of.
Okay. So
320, 330.
yeah, so if let's just say just 15 or 20% of them live in that area, they're coming. They're coming somewhere. And they sure as hell ain't going west because west ain't going to be that much better either. They're going to go north, though it almost feels like Keith. I feel so bad for Keith because like it feels like Canada, they're all going to migrate too. Shit, everybody's going to be living in Michigan and Ohio and Illinois and Indiana. It's just going to be like everybody crammed in these little spaces. So what does that lead to? Is that's going to lead to revolts. It's going to lead to insurrection. It's going to lead to people getting angry. It's going to lead to a downfall of democracy. It's inevitable, in my opinion. And I don't want to be a doomsdayer, and I'm not a prepper because I doubt I'll live 50 more years to even see this because that would put me at 80, 88. So maybe I'll live, maybe I'll get lucky, but probably not. I'm just gonna say that.
So you're just,
You'll get
you're
taken out by a forklift.
gradually killing me off because I'm older than you. So thank you very much for that. I certainly hope I live another 50.
Hey, if you're healthier than I am, Liam, you don't have
You
to worry
need-
about that.
Liam, you need to start joining some of the transhumanist groups. I mean, some of those guys want to put robots in your brain, or they want to take your body and elevate it to the next level. I don't know which one's going to be the right one, because there's actually a really intense argument as to which one of those things is the right one. Make the human body like a perfect thing, or put a bunch of robots in it, and they will fight you over that.
I say,
We have to be filthy rich. So for all of us plebs, we just get to die, and Elon Musk gets to be a brain in a jar. So
No,
Oh,
he's going to be a
Muskie.
brain.
later billionaires will take
He's
over.
going to be a brain in space.
Spider
He'll be a
robot
brain in space.
billionaires.
Aw, I want to be a brain in a space jar.
all right,
When you see the teacup, let me know.
there you go. So
I'll watch.
to kind of go back to when we first started our episode, we talked a little bit about variables, right? We talked about different types of variables, I believe, different categories that you can look at. And I think that's important to kind of go back to. And I can't remember if we covered all these and how in depth, so we'll go through them. And then if they start sounding familiar to everybody, we will go through them a little faster. But essentially, the idea is that there's different variables that lead to insurrection and democracy breakdowns, because this episode is a little bit more less focused on the insurrection aspect and more focused on why democracies collapse, for example. So the first variable that we look at is like an institutional variable, right? And you have different variables that kind of go into it. You have federalism, presidentialism, and proportionality, which I don't know if I said that word right, but if I didn't, you can add it to the list of things Keith is going to clip at someday in his future. And essentially what they do is they talk about different types of government systems, right? So a federalist government system is kind of like Germany or Great Britain, I believe. And like a presidential system obviously is like where we live. We elect the president, they have limited power, it's balanced by all these other things. And this is a variable that leads to what could be a cause for the collapse of democracy, right? Go ahead, Liam.
I was just going to say, just for anybody who cares, the German system is federalist, like ours is here. Britain is not. Britain is actually quite centralized. It's starting to move in that direction with devolution, but it still has a ways to go, and it isn't quite federalist in the same way of having powerful states. But
Gotcha.
still.
Yep, and what they do is they talk about how these federal states are more prone to democratic collapse than unitarian ones. And the idea behind that, right, is because you have more infighting, there's a lot of different people that are going to make decisions. Then when you get into something that's more of like a presidentialism, right, which is us, the bulk of the literature talks about how these type of regimes are prone to demonic collapse more than parliamentary ones. I don't know how to speak tonight. I haven't even been drinking, so like I don't know what it is. And so these also have issues, right? Because again, you're electing different parliaments of government that are interacting together. They can be led by different parties. It's not quite the same as how Germany does it, but it's pretty close. And so both of those have higher probability, right? And hence why Trump basically said, "Hey, make me your one and only emperor supreme, and we won't have these issues." Well, it's because they dictate.
Yeah, we kind
Make
of
me your king.
there. I mean, if federalist systems are more fragile and presidential systems are more fragile, we have both. The Germans have one, they're federalist, but they're not really presidential. Their president is a figurehead. They're essentially parliamentary. When you've got both, like we do, or like France. France is a presidential system, but also a highly centralized unitary state. So it doesn't have the federalism part. It makes the U.S. much more fragile than a lot of other countries that have one or the other, or neither in many cases.
Yep. And then that third one is that proportionality, right? That term talks about the difference in which proportionality is either low or high, right? In Canada, they have it's a lot lower, right? And it is a lot higher in other places like the Netherlands. And so the statistics talk about how they can hypothesize that certain electoral systems are more prone to collapse when they use less proportionality, right? So those are your three variables that go into the institutional category. Did I miss anything, Liam?
This
Is there
was this was your piece, but that sounds familiar to me.
okay? I didn't know if there was anything like if there's other institutional variable per se that you would look at, because then you get in.
Of making insurrections more probable, a significant institutional variable really has to do with the structure of police and military in society. So whether or not you have a deep state, which I don't know, newsflash to all the right wingers who might watch, but I doubt are watching, the U.S. doesn't actually have a deep state. Many countries do. We don't really have a completely unaccountable police force, but we're closer than many democratic societies are to having some of those lesser degrees of accountability, but still not quite the same thing. But societies that do have them, there's a whole range of instabilities that come in from that because they put a tremendous amount of pressure on people. They decrease your support for the government, your trust in it, your trust in the rest of the institutions. Because if you know that, like, the government can just drag you out and shoot you in the middle of the street and no one will ever care, you really don't have a lot of faith that they're looking out for your best interests. So when there's a crisis, you trust it less. You know what I mean? So, and then whether or not the military is political, and this is one of the few places where the U.S. actually has a decent advantage. It's one of the few things that actually does work really well in the U.S. is that while increasingly members of the military are political, the military as a whole is really devoted to its position within that constitutional framework and less likely to say, I don't know, overthrow the government or start massacring people.
Talk to Aung San Suu Kyi about that one.
Right. Yeah. I mean, militaries that will stay in the barracks, like say in Tunisia in the 2011 uprising, the military stayed in the barracks. So the people were able to take over the government and do something different. Whereas in Egypt, they just staged a coup so they wouldn't lose any of their own privileges. They were willing to get involved politically. It's their willingness to step up. Really has a great deal to do with things too.
Yep. And I think that, that kind of goes into, right, societal variables. That's the next kind of high level functioning point that we look at. So, like, and again, these are all, you have one category with several points underneath it, right? A category, several points. And all of these points are different variables on that spectrum. So, societal variables, there's, I have three of them too that I pulled out. One is cleavages, and not the ones you're probably thinking of. Malfunctioning economy, and unfavorable history, right? And all of those three are things that can lead to more an unstable democracy, hence then leads to insurrection. So, for example, a malfunctioning economy is, in my opinion, where the United States is on the verge of heading. I won't say we're 100% there because things still do move. We still are purchasing. We still aren't destitute, the majority of us. But that's if you have a significant problem, that leads to people wanting to revolt or go against a government. Because again, insurrections are not always bad, right? I mean, if somebody led an insurrection against Germany when they were killing all the Jews, that's not a bad thing, right? I mean, we punched Nazis, or we hope to punch Nazis if we can ever find them. But the idea behind it, if somebody had done those things, you have to look at, well, what helped the collapse of Germany, right? What was the reason Hitler was able to become so popular? And that's why a lot of us were a little scared with Trump, because Trump, again, showed some signs between his personality, his cult of this and that, and then you take the social economic factors. Hence, we're seeing, the police, like you said, militarizing the police to the point where there's little oversight. There is some, but not a lot. You remove that even farther, you're going to have bigger issues. So
I have a question for
yeah.
Liam on these nights. So, like, if you're looking at these societal variables, in this particular case, cleavages, malfunctioning economy, unfavorable history, are these the kinds of things that usually happen isolated, or are they things that layer themselves in, right? So, like, Chris just mentioned, we have what seems like a malfunctioning economy, but are those kinds of things that kind of happen independently, or is it like a layering system that just kind of snowballs and builds momentum?
Do you mean independent of other variables affecting the society, or independent as in not transnational? Or
Well, basically, it's just like if we're looking at a nation state and we've got something like these three things happening, is this like something that's like there'll be cleavages, but even if there is no problems with the economy or in the unfavorable history or something like that, like does it happen typically with one thing, or is it a variety? It's like a poker hand, right? You got a few variables that you're working with, or is it like just kind of one thing at a time?
generally, there are a number of things that build up together. Sometimes over periods of time. Sometimes there's quite a few things that hit all at once, and you get like, you know, some of those are where they often surprise you because several things go wrong all at once, rather than them building up where we can kind of say, oh, well, this is getting more unstable. Usually it's easier to kind of pick them out building up over time, and one tends to lead to the other. So, for example, a malfunctioning economy will actually push people into more extreme groups and more extreme ideologies. So then you build into another area. They tend to layer, if to use the term that you're looking at there, they tend to pile onto one another. And sometimes that can throw people off too. There's one thing that threw a lot of people off, especially in the early years of the Trump administration, where a lot of people, and granted, scholars in general, we tend to qualify everything, and well, this could be, but let's watch, and you don't really want to make quick judgments on the present. History of the present is actually quite difficult to do. Making judgments about what's happening right now. A lot of people tend to avoid that in my field. But a lot of scholars of extremism and fascism, of authoritarianism, were cautious about putting Trump in there, and especially connecting Trump to previous fascist and neo-fascist movements, because they didn't see some of the things that we always see in those regimes gaining power. One of the big ones was the economy is usually in worse shape. But there's an issue that's sort of missing there too. We have a few areas cushioning the U.S. In particular, there's a tremendous amount of wealth that the boomers hold, and a lot of the later generations depend upon them. How many people in my generation are depending upon boomer parents to take care of their kids because they can't afford childcare, or there's we give out easy credit, so tons of people can make up the difference in their lower income by picking up debt. So household debt takes off, but people still kind of get by. We're much worse off than it actually looks like, based upon the things they usually look at. Employment numbers, spending numbers, things like that all look kind of good, but it's deeply rotten under the hood. And when, like, I don't know, millennials hold 4% of the nation's
Yeah.
wealth, yeah, things do not look really good for where we're headed. But it wasn't as bad on the surface, and that threw people off. You had to look a lot deeper to see that rot
The
and how
Dow
that
Jones is setting records, Liam. The Dow Jones is setting
right,
records.
yeah, but it's making it's making a few percent of the population rich, and most people own no stock. So it gets really confusing is the thing. But they do layer, and sometimes those individual flawed areas are harder to notice getting bad in the first place, but you have to look deeper at them to see how they connect to those other layers. So the worsening economic situation is actually contributing to a lot more anxiety, a lot more extremism. But if you're sort of like, I don't know, some privileged New York Times writer doing pretty well and not noticing how bad things are, and oh yeah, things are, then you don't kind of get it. And there's plenty of liberal elites that just have no idea how bad things are for a lot of the country.
That's
Yeah.
what I was wondering if it's super clear or if it's usually kind of gray, which
It's
that's
usually
what I
pretty
expect.
murky.
In
Yeah,
hindsight, in 2020 hindsight, right? It'll be
exactly.
super, super clear. But
Right. The
while it's
hindsight
happening, a
is
little difficult.
always going to help out. But in many cases, the disintegration is slow and difficult to pick up on. You usually don't get something as convenient as, hey, look, it's a Great Depression right after a major war, and you've got all these big crises that, like, yeah, the 20s and 30s in Europe were super predictable in that way. Like, in hindsight, oh, yeah, you could not go through this significant an upheaval without a collapse in democratic institutions. But even there, no one had really gone through that before, so it was still kind of a surprise. But you usually don't end up with situations as extreme as that. They have to build up and layer, as you said, over time, and then in hindsight we can see how it
Well,
happened.
and I think we're looking at, and the reason I say the economy, the stock market is not a predictor, an indicator of the actual economy. That's an indicator of rich people. That's it.
Mhm.
Or people that have the means. You don't have to be rich, but people that have the disposable income to take care of that. Um, and that's where Trump always failed at that. But between the pandemic are the issues that we've had with the pandemic, the issues of the shipping pricing and prices increasing. And I could tell you, you don't want to know what a container cost one of our clients today. It's over 2 0. We'll just put it that way.
Oh,
Um, and you know, a year and a half ago, you're paying $4,000 a container. You're literally paying 500 times more than what you were for one container of product coming. So this is all going to scale into some sort of an economic collapse because Trump did not actually get us off of importation and back to producing at home. All he did is force manufacturers to move and people to absorb the taxes because it's still cheaper than it is to pay people to work in America.
One of the things I'm worried about on that is that all of that increase in costs and stuff like that is going to be blamed on putting money back into the economy under the inflationary perspective that if the United States puts more money into the economy and prints more money, it causes runaway inflation. There's a series of economic decisions that have been increasing inflation. Because one of the things that segments that we're going to be talking about soon, and I don't know if you're interested in modern monetary theory, Liam, but I just finished a couple of books on it, and I'm putting together a segment. I started it the last couple of weeks, and we're gonna do like as serious and deep of a dive as I can capable of doing it. Not being a trained economics expert, but like I really
Well,
am worried about people blaming the current decisions and things that have been happening on the inflation that's going to be happening and things that we're seeing. And I think a lot of those decisions are economic and socio political. But we'll see. Hopefully, if that changes what people as far as spending, because like
you
this child tax credit and some of these things that we've been seeing, like more money going into the economy and stimulus, whether or not that's going to be runaway inflation, like a lot of the conservatives are going to be
Yeah,
talking about. Like,
there just isn't. I mean, the structure of our economy would sort of prevent that. We don't have the kind of liabilities that, like, you know, Zimbabwe or Argentina or whatever would have had to cause that sort of thing.
because
We'll have inflation,
yeah.
but it's always going to be manageable. And if the spending is in certain areas where it stimulates growth, then it honestly doesn't matter. You know, it kind of
It's a fiat currency. We
exactly.
are a monopoly of our own
Well,
currency, and
it's the
technically it spreads into the world.
and we don't
Yeah.
have debt denominated in another currency. I mean, we don't
Mhm.
have things that can take. I mean, other countries can have fiat currencies and can still be hurt by other factors. We have none of the
No.
factors. You know, so yeah, I've done lectures on MMT. It's a fun
This would be a
subject.
cool concept. Then maybe I'll send you some messages or something. This would be really cool to check out. But that's something that we'll talk about in the future. But I think that's going to be connected to some of these variables that Chris has been talking about when it comes to like social, collapse or whatever. So I'm
so
interested to see.
it's but it won't be the inflation. That's not what. If people blame it, it's just a false blame. It's blamed. Us
Keyword for conservatives. Inflation. Ah, it's
I mean,
Biden's fault.
because it's not actually inflation. It's a shortage. It's capitalism. It's a shortage of goods with an increased cost to manufacture or produce or import them. It's not technically inflation.
yeah,
And
not in the sense of the value, but it's a decline in purchasing power. So yeah, and
yes,
people mix those two up because you
Yeah.
can technically apply the word to either because it is an inflation in the cost or whatever, but it's really only affecting our purchasing power, not the value of the dollar per se. And they're just
yes,
media is completely screwing up the messaging on that.
no, and you're right. And here's the problem: is
Joe
all of
Biden's
this.
fault.
It is going to be. You have no idea. Like I'm telling you right now,
Ooh.
especially because as soon as he took office, he released the stimulus checks, which did allow Americans to spend money. Now, what they don't understand is that to 12 companies own all the shipping lines coming out of the Asian area, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's not a monopoly, but it is to some extent. And what they don't understand is it's a cultural divide, right? And so that kind of talks about the next societal variable, right? Is unfavorable history. And that's the difference in less stable countries that have had up and down economies or economies controlled by the state.
Mhm.
They see these other things. And because not every economy is controlled by the state, because we don't live in a true socialist economy throughout the world, that's where the problems happen. Because if we lived in a true socialist economy throughout the world, theoretically, we would be able to eliminate a lot of the problems that cause inflation, the fake inflation that people talk about, right? And cause the increase in prices. And I could tell you this because an agent that we were paying $75 a container commission can now tell us, I want $600 or I'm going to give it to the next person over there. They
Jesus.
could just say these things. And what are you going to do? Because they control and own all of those lanes. And you can't go, even if, like, and this is what Home Depot did. Home Depot went out and bought, they didn't buy, but they went out and are basically paying for a full container ship. That way, nobody else's shit gets on there. It's all theirs. It's 100% theirs. They can import it. They can do whatever they want. For them, somebody, yeah, it's not cheap. That's super expensive. But for whatever reason, somebody did the math. And the math consisted of the fact that it was cheaper for them to do that in the long run than it was for them to purchase on the spot market or through their contracts. And our company is not strong. We're actually making money, sadly enough. More money than we probably should be based on our fee setups because they're now having to pay more. We get a commission rate. It's crazy. It is so highly volatile. It's not even funny. So that kind of goes into that unfavorable history category now, right? Is because, for example, Turkey, Peru, they don't have the most democratic backgrounds. Some other countries, like, I don't know, what's a good one? Switzerland, Norway.
Well, honestly, that's one of the few places where we are in decent shape too, is because we've had a
Yep.
ridiculously stable government. I mean, granted, that's where a lot of our flaws politically come in, is we haven't bothered really doing significant updates to an 18th century elitist document that created us.
Living document.
I mean, go figure. France is on its, fifth republic, and we're like, we'll just this constitution's fine, whatever. But
Mhm.
we have a long-term shared history with very few real hiccups, other than like the Civil War or whatever, that really kind of shake those foundations. Where, yeah, if you've had a history of military coups, if you've gone through multiple constitutions, yeah, the chances of a significant insurrection coming along are a bit greater.
Yes. Yep. So we move on to mediating variables, right? And they also have 3 points. I sort of got this article, it's a study, sorry, not an
The law of
article.
threes, man. It's comfortable.
It's the law of
nice. It's
threes.
not too
Everybody
many,
likes
it's
that
not too
shit.
few.
So they have what's called fragmentation, polarization, and government instability, right? And I know government instability is kind of like I'm going to say that's like an idiosyncrasy or something like that, or an idiism. I don't know what the hell you would call it. It's something silly because we're talking right now about what creates this, and it's a variable unto itself. And hence that's why these variables are not counted quite as heavily. They're not quite as heavily weighted as the other variables are. Wow, I just switched sides of the screen.
So,
And anyway, sorry.
yeah.
So that's the idea. Government instability is a big one, right? We have, like Liam said, we don't have to go through that. We have government stability, whether we like it or not. We do have that. That is a huge
Right.
mitigating factor.
Yeah, all the guys like stockpiling their guns because they're afraid of the government. I'm like, predator drone. I mean, really, you're not a threat. We have exactly, whether we like it or not, this government is not going down on its own.
Yep. On the opposite side, polarization is something where we do struggle with, but not to the extent of these other countries. We do have polarization, especially right now, but not, and again, I'm not the historian, but I don't feel it's as aggressive, right, as what we've had or have seen in some of these other countries, and that's what you talk about. Some of these are not horrible factors. Again, for example, France has had um, pretty high polarization of some of their government institutions over the last 50 to 60 years, right? They've gone through these changes even recently. And I think, understanding that polarization is a factor is something we want to work to mitigate. But at the same time, it's really hard for somebody like me to compromise my morals to, be like, all right, I'm going to accept the fact that you want abortions, in fact that you'll not vote for Trump again, or you get rid of abortions, but you'll never vote for Trump or somebody like him again. It's a really hard, thing, and so polarization has become a big thing because either we have a two-party system. You vote Democrat or you vote Republican, or you don't vote, or you vote third party and yell at everybody. And the later two yell at everybody in some way, shape, or form and tell us all we're wrong. So it doesn't matter. It's polarization in all four lanes.
Basically, in the end, what you're talking about is whether or not incrementalism is going to be the thing that actually does succeed, because the polarization is going to drive the pendulum harder and harder and harder in each direction. And I'm assuming Liam can maybe think of something in the past that would be similar to that. Is the idea of momentum swinging back and forth. It's kind of my personal perspective as to how the U.S. government works, having a two-party system. The pendulum seems to swing harder and harder in each direction. Each time we see a change in party, we see, hey, executive actions are the only way we can really make the changes because Congress is in a gridlock, and it's always in a gridlock, and so those are the only places we can make those changes or whatever. And the pendulum swings harder and harder and harder in each direction, and we see more polarization, more aggressive in each side to try to, whatever. And I don't know if society ever goes in the opposite direction where the swings are less aggressive, and you actually see society kind of coalescing around more centralized and less aggressive and more centrist values. I don't know if societies typically have an ebb and flow that would be extremism to I guess more monoculture perspectives and something like that. It would be interesting if they did, but my assumption is that the general shape and structure of human society and nation states has basically been, it's been kind of like a unified monoculture to fragmentation, and then dissipation, and then new states evolve and form out of those states. It's like some of these variables would be some of those things that would cause that, as opposed to like states being able to manage and repair themselves and start a new cycle. Is that a thing that happens
Yeah,
much? Or
I'm trying to keep track of several different things here because there's a few things you've said that are interesting and that Chris had said there. So first, in terms of the pendulum swings that you're pointing to, and you're saying like greater and greater swings. There's a way I think we probably have to qualify that a little bit because we have actually less extreme swings when parties take power than almost any other advanced society has, like at all, because the politics don't really change much. Like what actually is happening, it doesn't really change much. If you get down to it, when you look at the actual positions that Biden is for versus Trump, they're really, really, really close. There's not a lot that's going on there. What gets more extreme is the partisanship part. They they perceive any possible shift as being oh my god, it's like some existential crisis because the other side took power, and oh my god, I guess we're communists now, and like it's the end of the world, a bunch of like Chicken Little screaming. That I think is the bigger problem. The polarization in the U.S. is actually kind of off the hook. We're kind of losing something.
politics is really bad.
Yeah, it's not as bad as it has been in some of the places where you don't really have a long history of stable institutions, where you've gone through multiple coups and major changes in government. So, like, polarization in Turkey is worse.
Oh yeah.
But Turkey has also had 4 major military coups and several attempted ones, and a whole lot of like major constitutional changes in the last century. So, not really comparable to 250 years of relative stability. But there's just no comparison between the U.S. and any other advanced democracy in terms of that polarization. You'll have parties with far greater ideological differences, but the members of the parties still hold on to a really important concept for stable democracies, for avoiding insurrections and collapses, and that is a loyal opposition. When the other party takes power, you don't worry about them immediately plotting to make sure that no one else will ever knock them out, that they will become the ruling party permanently. Or when you lose the election, you don't immediately start planning a coup because you can't trust those guys. When one party or the other is saying that the other side are Satan, that they can't be trusted, that they will destroy the country, that they hate America, that's a really, really dangerous sign. And it is a bellwether for major insurrections and collapses, because we'll see societies that do have these problems, they lack that concept. They don't have the concept of a loyal opposition. And we've lost it for a significant chunk of the American population. You poll Republicans, and they're and just huge numbers of them will say, like, yeah, the Democrats cannot be trusted. They hate America. If they're in charge, they will destroy America. We must defeat them at all costs. And they use that to justify all the voter suppression stuff. They don't care about minority rule because they're so afraid that the other side will destroy the fabric of the nation for them, that they can rationalize seizing power however you look at it. And at the end of the day, as much as they want to jump through all kinds of weird verbal gymnastics about the voter suppression tactics because they understand that it has a bad connotation to it, internally they're quite clear about it, and within people's heads they're quite clear about what they're doing. They honestly don't care if a minority controls things, because they're terrified of the real majority. They're terrified of the Democratic coalition or whatever ruining the country. So
It's funny their fears will override their constitutional literalism. That's one of the issues that's always funny. It's just like you'll hear people like, read the transcripts, read the Constitution, right? Like the literalism that they talk about. But then also it's just like, well, what's your background and your understanding and education about those kinds of things, like the separation of church and powers and minority rule and those kinds of things. Often that is like a second thought, as opposed to there's a winner and there's a loser. And I feel that winner and loser thing, it's almost absolutism nowadays. So it's like it's almost becoming evangelical, and that's one of the things that kind of connected Chris and everybody else that we've been in our communities. I mean, all of this stuff when we first started hanging out was kind of fighting that, like, there's an absolute evil happening here. And then Keith joined in a little bit later when we were meeting more people. Like, those kinds of absolute perspectives, like, I never had those, but I know they did. I know they were like, there is an absolute enemy evil, and I think that kind of merged with politics, and it's
I think
frightening.
one of the problems that we often have looking at these is that when we consider what makes up a particular political philosophy, we have a tendency to put way too much weight on what people say their beliefs are, and not what they actually are, based upon practice, what you actually do. There is a real disconnect between the real principles that a lot of so-called American conservatives, I mean, use it because a lot of conservatives are not really conservative, but we have to use the term they're using, right? But a lot of them will say, yeah, I'm a constitutional this or that, and they're really not. At the end of the day, a lot of that stuff really is circumstantial. Even, and this is tricky for a number of interesting kind of like bipartisan issues. So corruption, for example. If you ask conservatives over and over again, they answer the same way a lot of liberals and leftists do. Corruption is bad. You shouldn't be buying Washington. Yeah, drain the swamp. Fuck the bankers. I mean, they'll get behind all that kind of stuff. But if their people are in charge, they don't care anymore. It's circumstantial, because there's a default overrides that within the philosophy, that they expect their leaders to cream off the top. There's a kind of an accepted hierarchical understanding that's inherent to conservatism. And if you leave out that hierarchical nature and that understanding that the elites should be able to take certain advantage, that they should have certain perks. Yeah, it's okay that he's cheating on his wife because he's whatever, he's rich. Whereas you criticize your neighbor. There's a difference in power based. So somebody might take the kind of conservative Christian principle, think about family values, right? You shouldn't cheat on your spouse or this or that or have abortions or anything else there. But when powerful people do it, they don't blink. Look at the support for Trump. This confuses liberals endlessly that the religious right embraced Trump, and the reason is stunningly obvious if you look at the real underlying ideology and not what they say. If you hear what they say, then yeah, it makes no sense that this, philandering, this, adulterous, multiple times married, whatever. It does it makes no sense to people, but it really, really does.
Those are the social variables that, I mean, obviously are probably connecting into here. I mean, in all reality, the political system variables and like polarization and stuff, all of these variables are tying into things that basically make democracy less stable. The one that I think is interesting, and this is something that's kind of tied into what we're looking at as well, is the extraneous variable. This is foreign involvement. Is one of the things that we have in a document here that Chris pulled. It's essentially that there are other involvements in severe threats from other foreign countries. Now, I honestly don't think the threat is as severe as we see it, but it's also significant. So there's a difference in like how infiltrated they are. But I think the United States is definitely seeing attacks from a variety of places when it comes to Russia and China. Just recently this week, we basically announced that the Chinese are involved in a series of hacks, and the Russians were involved in a series of hacks for the last couple of elections. So like we're seeing these other powers inside the foreign political economy that are actually starting to do some things like this. This is also, like the United States, Wilsonian expansion is a great example of the United States using these extraneous variables to destabilize all kinds of Central American countries, and we're still reaping the benefits of all of that chaos now. And so, like, this is something that probably is tried and true as far as any major giant corporate states are concerned, because this to me is something that the United States is guilty of in our history, and I think this is probably something that is pretty straightforward in history, or at least in your experience.
Yeah, in terms of the U.S. record of interfering, yeah, we have a long history of deterring democracy wherever it will benefit corporations. So yeah, um,
What?
but but I don't know, the whole question of foreign influence. There's a tricky aspect to this, I think, because it is important in the sense of perception, the degree of perception of foreign involvement, and that can vary a bit too in terms of like the side where you are. So liberals getting really upset about Chinese or Russian interference in elections versus I don't know, conservatives being super weirded out about like, oh my gosh, there's Muslims moving here and they want to be terrorists or something, and there's all kinds of various ways you can connect foreign context to the U.S. one, but none of them actually are a threat, and that I think is something that people really don't get either. So yeah, are they spying on us? Yeah. Are the Russians spying on us? Yeah, to the degree that they're able to do it. Yeah, but you know what? The Soviet Union was actually better at infiltration and spying than we were during the Cold War, and they were here throughout that whole period too. They actually massively infiltrated a ton of Western
The
European countries
Cubans.
really, really effectively. I mean,
Cu-
hell, they got to like they got to the German Chancellor's office. They actually had one of the aides to Willy Brandt's government was literally a Soviet spy. I mean, they're pretty good at that sort of thing. This is not new, and we do it too. The issue here is the Russians can spy all they want in our elections. They can poke into machines, look around at this stuff here, but at the end of the day, there's generally enough of a paper trail behind anything that they're not going to change the results. They're not going to, and it's pretty obvious which side really had the ability to win. So like I don't know, if suddenly like the green candidate won an election, we would all kind of know the Russians did that and just say, yeah, that was bullshit, yeah, and call a mulligan and we do it over. I mean, it's not as big a threat as we tend to think it is, but the perception of the threat further destabilizes the country, and it pushes the two sides apart because they perceive different foreign threats, again, you know real to varying degrees, but they're different, and it increases that kind of polarization and the distrust in institutions. And that honestly is the sole reason the Russians and the Chinese are really doing it. The Russians know they're not going to take down the U.S. government by poking around in state election servers. What they're trying to do is
Discord.
clear and get people to distrust institutions, get people to distrust elections. If more people think the elections are rigged, and that's the real danger of what has been
Yeah.
polling for I mean, and he did this from the beginning of his election too. When he first started talking about this in 15 and 16, yeah, I might not accept the results. I mean, that claiming it's all rigged. He was expecting to lose in 16 and was claiming preemptively that it was all rigged. And then when he won, oh yeah, no, I guess it wasn't, and he went right back to it when it looked like he was going to lose again. That's intentional. And that's what the Russians really want to do, because the more people who distrust the institutions and think the elections are fake, the easier it is to further suppress votes and to destabilize the society. And that's our freaking fault. We can't really blame the Russians for that. That's us fucking up and not really dealing with our problems, because what they're doing is kind of predictable. They've been doing it really well since the 60s. It's not new.
Yeah. And I think that, that kind of goes into that the next part of the discussion. So those are all the different variables, right? That talk about, what are big, what are the issues with the downfalls, right? There was an article written by Inside Huck that talk about, did the Roman insurrection actually anticipate the Capitol breach by 20,000 years?
2000.
20,000, 2,000 years. Good God. All right. Anyway, so
Oh, that's the best.
blow it out your ass. All right. So what I want to do is we're gonna have Buddy take us through this article here. And essentially, like, the idea here is to analyze whether the article's correct. Did any of these stuff predict it? Or is it something that we're unsure and think this is more, what do I want to call it, propaganda from the other side of the fence?
Ooh.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to do a quick review of this, and it seems that oh goodness, there's a where the hell did I get to on this one here? Um, Talking about the Roman Empire, first century CE. Um, Now, according to the World History article, it was like the perfect empire. The Romans were very powerful in terms of their military prowess, which you want when you have a military, I guess, which they were using to expand their empire. And once the territories were theirs, they would of course install their power to the capital, um, install the power from the capital of the empire to the local governments and territories. And I, I apologize. My brain is still really, really foggy. I think I may have had a little too much sun today. To be honest, I've been fading out. I don't know if anybody's noticed. So I'm trying to make sure that I'm here. So if I'm trailing off or if I seem glazed,
Well, one of the things that I know
just
about
laugh.
one of the things I know about the entire Roman situation, and one of the things that we were looking at in this, is that what they basically tried to do was assimilate without completely changing the philosophy and the style of the peoples in which they absorbed, and that definitely changed when you're bringing things together, right? So like the
Yeah.
early when they were taking over certain areas, essentially what they were doing was they were completely changing the philosophy, concentrating a lot, and working with the groups and making sure that all the people in the military were well paid, well trained, and really, really, really well done, so to create an efficient and effective military. And one of the things that happens when you get so big, you get so over encumbered, you start looking at multiple front warfare, and you essentially stretch all of your resources and everything thin. And so one of the things that I've mentioned this multiple times in the history of the show is that the Roman Empire essentially was looking at trying to go too big too fast, and what they couldn't do was they couldn't keep the philosophy between everybody the same, keep a homogenous culture. And one of the things that they found when they were looking at creating a good democracy is that they were unable to kind of keep everything in the same vein. And so when you would just say, "Oh, we defeated you, you're now part of us," without giving any real reason for assimilation, real reason to be part of the empire. Here's a financial perk. Here's a series of institutional growth. Here's an infrastructure upgrade to your country. All of these kinds of things that I know that the Roman Empire was, like, at the beginning very good at, and later on very not. with restrictions and resistance to taxation and things like that. And so, like, my assumption is that in this article, which I haven't completed, is that they're probably talking about something of that nature, which essentially when you're not covering the basic needs of the people in which you've assimilated, you're going to start seeing these kinds of insurrections and these kinds of runs on the Capitol. And
You might,
I can see Liam just chewing on his fingertips. He's got something
oh,
here.
yeah. I was gonna say, do you mind if I poke in on this one here, because there's I gotta say, just especially in just popular culture, in like popular history, like there's a bazillion YouTubers who talk about this stuff. There are a lot of misconceptions around the Romans, and it's oftentimes where a lot of these facile comparisons can really break down, because they have some of the specifics really wrong. So first off, most of the expansion was under the Republic. The empire actually didn't bother growing at all for 2 centuries. There's almost no growth. So they added Britannia. That's pretty much it,
Yeah.
and then briefly moved into Romania and then left it. Briefly conquered a portion of Mesopotamia and then immediately left it. Like, they didn't really, from the time of Augustus on, there's almost no change to the borders. And one of the underlying problems is that the Roman economy doesn't have any of the resilience that you would have with a modern economy, whether socialist, capitalist, anything like that. It's a very different economic model at the time, that if you're going to be able to afford the kind of things they were trying to do, you needed to keep expanding in order to bring in the wealth from all the different conquests and the new tax bases there. They actually did, for a long time, in the early imperial period, they invested heavily in the first century and a half, 2 centuries, in infrastructure in different areas. And it's one of the reasons that they did actually have a pretty remarkable record for 2 centuries in assimilation, because they gave people, oh, you just
Yeah.
built like a 10-mile long aqueduct. I love you. This is great. Like, oh, the city
Yeah.
doesn't stink all the time anymore. We've got
Mm,
sewers. Like, they
yeah.
did a lot. So it really helped with a lot of that. Where they ran into problems, and the economy started getting really, really shitty in the 3rd century, is because of the long-term effects of stagnation, of not expanding and building on that, and not really having a more resilient economic model to make up for that. So they were spending a ton on infrastructure, spending a ton on the military, and they still had a limited population and tax base. So the taxes ended up getting higher on people, which starts to erode the social structure. People often, like, I don't know. I get to do this in um, in some of my classes, because I teach a course on the ancient Mediterranean, and I also at a different campus teach like the Middle Ages. And I always I try to like connect these for people and help them see the relationship. All the stuff that really built up into Western European feudalism came out of the disintegration of the Roman order. What eventually became all those different feudal lords are a wealthy person in a Roman city said, fuck these taxes, moved out to his villa in the countryside and stopped paying them, and then built a militia to protect his own property. And then poor people in the cities, their taxes went up because the state lost the rich people, so they had to raise taxes on working people. Working people couldn't afford it, so they moved out into the countryside, and they pledged themselves to these people, said, hey, I'll, like, I don't know, work for you in a kind of virtual slavery if you just protect me from the authorities who want to tax the hell out of me. And next thing you know, you got the feudal peasantry. It's a long-term process out of that disintegrating order. But the weak economy and the tax base are ultimately at fault for a lot of that disintegration in the Roman society across the West. And a lot of that really comes out of the fact that the empire just didn't expand. It couldn't afford what it was doing anymore. It was basically, it was too unwieldy for what it could draw on.
It's
So
interesting. I wonder if it's a restriction on technology and communication and
yeah,
warfare, and
there's a ton of
basically
things.
it just
Yeah,
takes
there's
6 months for something communication to get to the edge of the front, so to speak. And so, like, you just can't communicate and cooperate and create something that large with the limitations of technology at the time.
think about the impact of that on the economy, because you have all these commercial networks, right? There's movement of goods all over the place. There's just tons of boats moving all over the Mediterranean. There's tons of road networks moving goods around, but it moves as fast as your feet go. So the goods can't get to market very, very quickly, and they can't go as far. You didn't have, like, I don't know, refrigerator trucks to move things over long distances, right? So it kind of limits a lot of that. And they didn't have anything like the banking system that we have. So they had trade, they had commerce, but they didn't have capitalism because they had no way of really pooling the resources, raising large amounts of money to move stuff. And even if they could, there was no reason to do it because the technology wasn't there to move faster. And at the end of the day, they were still a slave society. So there's a lot of the fact that they had slaves actually is a significant inhibitor to economic growth. It's the same thing that made the Southeast in the U.S. so economically weak compared to the rest of the country, and why the South got its ass kicked in the Civil War. It really never had a shot at winning just because of the size of the economy. If they didn't win in that first year, they were screwed. It's sort of like the Germans invading the Soviet Union. If they didn't knock them out
Oh yeah,
immediately, they were screwed because a
yeah,
small country doesn't take out a big country. You just
yeah.
can't. The size of the economy in the South was limited by slavery because it lowered the earning potential of their own working and middle classes. There was less incentive to develop tons of other areas.
Yeah.
The Romans just didn't have that because they had lots of slaves.
So
So,
that kind of like restriction or whatever in ancient Rome, like leading to something like an insurrection that we had in the United States, like essentially they're taxing the middle class, they're just destroying their actual earning class, and the elites were probably like, I don't need to pay taxes. This is BS. I'm not gonna do it.
right.
And
That
so
is what we really have. Yeah.
we have a bunch of middle class and lower class working people who are like, I'm done. This is BS. I
Mhm.
quit. But actually, you know what? We're gonna go into the Capitol and we're gonna sack this thing. Like, I think that's what the point of the article is. Is like they're trying to point to some parallelism that's happening here. It may not be as massive in scale because a lot of people think of the Roman Empire as like this epic, grand thing, and it's. I mean, at the time it was, but like if you compare it to social structures and the numbers that we're looking at nowadays, like it may not be quite as comparable, but this philosophy and the things that they were upset about might not be that different, and I think that's kind of what they're
Right.
talking about.
What people often run into, and this is, and again, I don't know the article you're looking at, but where people often make a lot of really interesting comparisons between us and the Romans, they often are looking at completely the wrong issues. So they'll point to things like immigration and assimilation as like a major factor. And
Mhm.
it's a really minor factor in comparison to other
Really?
ones like the economy. The bigger issues we are looking at here is, yeah, the middle is being squeezed too much, and working people are being squeezed. And ultimately, a lot of that comes from Republican policies that cut the taxes on the rich.
Yeah.
So states and municipalities have to make that up somewhere. So they raise our taxes. So everyone's paying more. And then that just fuels the anti tax rhetoric on the right and gets people more and more angry. And it gets them to hate the government more. And there was a lot of that distrust of the Roman state over taxation. You did have a lot of that in the third and fourth centuries. So there's a similarity, at least there, in terms of feeling an unjustified burden. For what I'm getting, I'm paying too much.
Were there
But
any other, I guess, variables or drivers that weren't economic that the Roman Empire was dealing with that may have caused it? So, like, there's a variety of things that people blame in the U.S. for the most recent push for like the closest thing that I've ever seen for a violent overthrow. In most of that stuff in our community, we see those as economic drivers that drove those people into those places. They see it as a philosophical and evangelical and
cultural
whatever,
differences, yeah.
reasoning. So like, are those kinds of like discrepancies between what people are actually think they're fighting for versus what they really are fighting for, do they
Oh no,
exist?
that's an interesting one. Because honestly, no, a lot of there's a problem oftentimes with telling people what they really are feeling. A lot of people and you get this a lot with liberals telling conservatives, you're voting against your interests, you're voting against your interests. Well, no, anti-abortion is my interest because if they care more about the cultural issue, then that's their choice, right? And those are really really important. But outside of the economic and to a very small degree the some of the structural issues in assimilation, again the specifics are vastly different because of the extremely low populations overall, the fact that it mostly affected only the military. It's not really it's nothing like our immigration issues. But there is a factor there that you can make at least the tiniest of connections. Most of the other ones that actually tore down, in various ways, both the Western and Eastern Roman empires, they really don't have any parallels to here. So tons of massive outside pressures, large-scale invasions. We don't have like Attila, the Hun, or like the Bulgars pushing in toward Constantinople. There's no outside forces coming in. We don't have constant military coups when this general or the other decides to become the emperor, kills the other one, and seizes power, and then you get a civil war. The Romans had like a civil war of the week kind of thing going on. There was a lot of turnover for a long time. We don't have any of that instability.
We've got the Walton family and the Sacklers. That's how it works here in the United States. We'll throw opioids at you, and we'll give you really really bad wages. I mean, that's
We
just
have a
kind of
lot
how it
more
feels here.
resilience in our political system than the Romans ever had. And the system actually, the Roman government was held together largely by tradition. Its basic legal structure is an incoherent pile of, it's like a big pile of spaghetti. They just threw it down and said, make it work somehow. Whenever they wanted to solve a problem, they would introduce a new law and then they wouldn't change the old thing. So you ended up with tons of layers of completely irrelevant people and pointless bureaucracy and tons of like things held. And a lot of it was, and this is one of the reasons it became an empire in the first place. So a lot of these problems go back over a long period of time. The only thing that actually kept somebody from ever really seizing power was they knew it was naughty. You shouldn't do it. Like there was really nothing that would prevent you from doing it. There was all these like flaws in it that anybody could exploit, and those never really went away. They just slapped on tons and tons of band-aids.
What do they call those? I think it's called blue laws in the United States. Basically, we have laws that, like, in certain cities and certain counties, whatever, you're not allowed to move the furniture in your home without notifying the local or whatever. And so, like, I mean, assuming that you have, those absurd levels of bureaucracy, but this is interesting. Like, I think that it's Inside Hook. We have the link in the description that we posted with the video, but it's an interesting parallelism because I have called this out many times. It's like the parallelisms that we see at the end of Empire and stuff. And I some of the things that you've mentioned, like some of the heavier drivers, I had always thought that the external forces from people being assimilated into the empire and then just never being fully assimilated was one of the driving factors, and they just essentially they never became fully
Yeah,
Roman, and that was
inside
one of the things that really like affected
yeah,
the mercenary class and the military class and stuff like that.
for
But
hundreds of
apparently,
years,
it's not at
everywhere they
them.
spread, I mean, people just adopted that identity, and they had really good reasons for doing so. Because, I mean, unlike, I don't know, earlier understandings of citizenship, like the Greek, where you really couldn't adopt citizenship easily, it didn't get extended. The Romans had no problem really doing that. They would conquer a city, and they would say, okay, now, if you guys are nice, we're going to give you this lower level of citizenship, and you'll get some rights. I'm like, okay, cool, cool. And if you don't revolt again, we'll give you full citizenship, and then you're effectively a Roman. And most Roman citizens never got anywhere near the city of Rome, but they understood themselves as because they had all the legal rights and privileges of a Roman. In the central part of the empire, in the parts that had been the empire since the Republic, all of that was incredibly stable. The only places where immigration was a problem for the Romans were on the frontiers. So when large numbers of Germans crossed the border because, like, I don't know, different waves, like, Slavs were coming in or whatever, were pushing them, more waves of migration were coming in. And they would turn to the Romans and say, can we, like, live on your side of the border? And if we can, we'll pay our taxes and serve in the army. And then the Romans were like, you'll pay your taxes? Yeah. You'll serve in the army? Yeah. Okay, sure. This valley is totally empty. Go live there. But they came in such volumes and started taking enough military positions that it eventually got to where, easily 2/3 of the Roman military actually spoke German at one point, not Latin. But that's because the army was all on the frontier. The army wasn't present in most of the empire. It was all on the Danube and the Rhine
Something that I
River
had read
and the
is that
East.
there were like
So there, it's
huge
a problem.
portions of the military that had never actually even seen Rome.
And we're not really culturally Roman. They were culturally German. They were Germanic peoples, but they served in the army. But again, that's only on the frontiers. That had nothing to do with the decay in Italy, in Spain, in France, in places that have been part of the empire for a long time. The changing composition of the military and the migration on those frontiers didn't have and this is where people like Sargon of Akkad are completely full of shit. That migration played no part at all in weakening the empire. It actually kept the army strong and helped it to protect the frontiers because it gave it the numbers that it needed at a time when there was massive population pressures.
It's
It did mean
interesting.
that those areas themselves were a little bit less Roman, but where Belgium is today was never terribly Roman to begin with.
It's
But southern
interesting.
France was super Roman, and none of that was affected by immigration. The people there all understood themselves as Roman.
Well, what you had included something about the Great Jewish Revolt, Chris, that I thought was something that might
Ooh.
be relatively interesting here when they're talking about 66 CE.
Yeah, the the Great Jewish Revolt essentially is the Roman Empire in the early first century CE was regarded as that perfect empire, kind of like what we've been talking about, right? Roman law was the land, their religion was the land, they had all the technology, all of that fancy stuff, right?
Mhm.
So Roman rule extended into Palestine, right? And that's we all know that's a hot spot. It's a pretty big hot spot. Um, and with the Romanization of Jewish cultures and different classes, it led to different corruption that flared up under. And I'm not going to try and say this guy's name, so don't ask me. Some crazy guy, Epiphanius. Um, and essentially, what that led to is a lot of the Jewish people saying, "Well, I don't agree with this. We need to get out. We need to do something different. We need to move past this." And that's kind of what started this whole discussion. You had the corruption of the state, you had suppression of people's religion, you had the desire to or force their culture into Jewish culture. And that's kind of where we, let off. So, um
This is a good one, actually. Um,
Is
uh,
it the
because
Seleucos? Is that the
oh,
guy's name?
so, Seleucus, that's an earlier. That's the revolt that became the Hasmonean. That's the Maccabees.
Is that the one that you
yep.
were talking about, Chris? So it's SELEUCOS?
Sure, that's not what I said, but yes.
Yeah, okay. Totally different war, but there's a similar one
Yes.
too.
Yeah. Oh, there's
The
a
Roman
different
Jewish
one.
War,
Caesarea.
the first Roman Jewish War in 66, and the Hasmonean uprising against the Seleucids actually do have one really big thing in common, and that's a sense of um, the culture being threatened by outside influences. By like Greco-Roman cultural norms. Like you got all these like I don't know little boy diddlers who like wine and racetracks and whatnot. You're like, oh my god, culture, uh, and people were genuinely upset by that. But there's an interesting one you bring up specifically for thinking about the Roman Jewish War in particular. Because it's kind of a perfect storm in that it combines two really different things. The first Roman Jewish War, the immediate proximate cause is taxes. It really did start as a tax revolt. What made it bigger was the cultural issue because they could point to those Romans are still outsiders. Now, granted, this is after 3 centuries of consistent Greek cultural influence, so it wasn't as big an issue as it was for the Hasmoneans when they were like really freaked out about how different Greeks were culturally from controlling the area because the Greeks spread across the Eastern Mediterranean. That was the war against Seleucids was much more cultural than the Roman Jewish War. But the cultural issue did play a part in making the Roman Jewish War a more significant issue rather than just a completely irrelevant sort of like tax revolt. Because tax revolts happen all the frickin' time for the Romans. People would freak out. I'm not gonna pay my taxes. They burn down a government building, and then the soldiers would beat them up, and life would go on. But when they could point to a significant difference like that they were culturally very very different. You had something to play with. There aren't that many places like that in the Roman Empire that weren't as heavily assimilated. The fact that the Romans gave the Jews a remarkable amount of like leeway culturally because they were very conservative people. They respected tradition. They're like, yeah, Judaism's been around forever. Whatever, you guys do your own thing. You don't have to like respect the emperor. You can totally flip the emperor off as long as you pay your taxes. I don't care. Everyone else, they were like, yeah, you gotta like worship the emperor. Like they were much more aggressive about that sort of thing. But that helped them preserve a significant core of cultural difference too. that wasn't really present in a lot of areas that did more heavily assimilate.
When it was threatened, that was something they were willing to fight over because they had it.
Right. So once a tax revolt broke out, it could gain more sympathy, and people could more easily get behind the idea of kicking out the Romans, because at the end of the day, they still thought of them as kind of as occupiers. They still weren't really locals. But those cultural differences too are ultimately why the First Roman Jewish War was such a disaster, because they couldn't get their shit together. They fought each other more than anything else. There was more cultural cleavages, more cultural polarization within Palestine than there was between the peoples of Palestine and the rest of the Roman Empire. There was,
That's not a surprise.
and that
Yeah.
also is similar to the U.S. too.
Yeah.
There's because a lot of it has to do with a similar problem that we have here. The way that we understand change. One of the big things that obviously liberals and conservatives are always fighting over, right? You had factions that were like really hardcore for following the law and doing everything just the right way, letter of the law, like go to the temple, do all this stuff here. And there's the much more sort of decentralized kind of that's where people similar to like Jesus. Honestly, Jesus and the Pharisaic movement are kind of similar in that they both wanted a very decentralized approach to religion. And you've got the whole like, oh my God, the Romans and Greeks are just insane people and total perverts, and we need to like move out to the desert and create our own little hermit communities. Like your zealot groups, or your kind of like Essene communities. Like the Dead Sea Scrolls is an Essene community.
And
And then
whatever the guy was in South Africa.
Well, more than that, Koresh, you're thinking too, like there's apocalyptic prophets.
Okay.
We
So prophets were appearing during this time period.
all over the place, massive issue in the 4th century. Like Jesus was not unusual at all.
I know.
The fact
We
that
know.
that became a big religion, and honestly, one other one still survives that almost no one's heard of. There's the Mandean religion started by John the Baptist still exists. I mean, there's only like 30,000 of them. It's tiny, but it technically stuck around. But there were a ton of apocalyptic prophets out there, and they were all responding to the socio-political circumstances, to like the issues in the Roman Empire itself, and pointing to those problems and saying, "This is a big mess, and God needs to fix it for us. We got to get right with God." So that cultural difference, that kind of religiosity, that desire to hold on to that distinctiveness and to look for a kind of theological answer to what are ultimately political and economic questions, that's something we also see a lot of in the U.S. today. It's one of the things driving a lot of the evangelical movement is looking for religious answers to political questions.
Or a political lightning rod, like who's the martyr that can save us? Who is the singular solution to the problem? It's one of the things that we see. It's like it's a coalescence of power, and who can be the one person that can like be the solution, as opposed to what's the party, what's the group, what's the philosophy, the ideology. Like it seems to be concentrating more and more and more towards one particular savior or thing like that. That's one of the things that I know Chris and I are more fearful of. It's just like we see this isolation in collective, and it's kind of scary, man. I mean, I don't know if those kinds of concentrations in power, fear, and wealth in the older societies and nation states, but it's definitely something that we're scared of in the current modern societies as well.
The power of a lot of these mega church type preachers, when they have like a really huge following, that is something to be concerned with in many ways. But I think the religion in the U.S. is still pretty radically decentralized. There's still a lot of competition and a lot of different people trying to establish themselves as like I am the faith leader of choice. Everyone should look to me. And like, no, I like that guy more. All right. It does is it just contributes.
It's not Sunni and Shia. It's not.
It contributes a lot more to the kind of fracturing in society. A breakdown in the way we can relate to one another. And there's a religious concept that's sort of similar to the one I mentioned earlier, the whole loyal opposition for politics, where you don't think the other party is going to like kill us all. We were moving for a long time toward a greater and greater sort of ecumenical understanding, like that people of different religions, it's fine, that's their family, whatever. My neighbors are Hindu, I have to kill them, kind of thing. People were kind of like getting used to diversity as just a thing. But decades of constant culture wars and villainizing of different people has brought back to the surface a lot of things that we thought were disappearing. Like I don't know when I was a kid and people were passing around like those little chick tracts that they would leave in the bathroom. I don't know. Have you guys ever seen a chick tract in the Midwest?
Yes, I collect them.
Yeah. I did too for a long time. They were great. People they're like, oh my god, what is this thing? They're horrifying. But
Insane.
the kind of ideas in them, you go back to the 80s and 90s, most people would not have bought that. But some of those things are getting more mainstream. There is a disturbing trend back towards some anti-Semitism in American Christian movements, right? And obviously massive Islamophobia, right? There are signs that of declining tolerance of other religions. And if you look at some of the biggest extremist movements that we've had in this country's history, I don't know. Okay, so at what point was the Ku Klux Klan actually at its greatest height? You guys did a lot of stuff on like religion, right? You know when the Klan was most powerful?
I guess 60s, mid 60s.
Sort of like third wave and actually quite weak, much earlier.
Yeah, it's like early 1900s, like late 1800s, if I remember right.
It's specifically earlier 20th century. It's actually the 1920s. The 1920s are
There you go.
the heyday for the Ku Klux Klan, not the later 19th century when it was focused much more on African Americans. In the late 19th century, the big fights in the South were using the Klan to break down solidarity between working people and break the populist movement. And in the North, to all do the same thing to weaken the trade union movements there, as like you got the Great Migration and black people moving north, and you got to like somehow stop the workers from working together in unions, so you bring in more racism. But it was focused so much on black Americans that it didn't actually have as much resonance with Americans. When the Klan became most powerful is when they attacked Jews and Catholics. The
Yep.
1920s, tons and tons of anti-Catholic rhetoric and tons of anti-Jewish rhetoric, and that broadened their appeal so much they became a massive mainstream movement. And that's
Because you could hate anybody as long as you ain't white. They don't care.
yeah, and of course, what makes you white becomes really contestable too, because those Italians clearly aren't white. A bunch
That
of
was the
crazy
thing. It was
papists
like,
or whatever. They could argue over those
yeah.
things, and it's not really coincidental that we're seeing this big fight with like America first and that kind of rhetoric, because that was literally a Klan slogan and was used also by the pro-Nazi movement, like the German American Bund in the 1930s, also used America first. Both of those movements used that same phrase, and and when Trump resurrects it, it's not a coincidence because it's pointing back to the same tactics of division used in America First. America First is not a patriotic movement. Patriotism and nationalism, very different things. It's not about a patriotic movement for the country. It's about a specific understanding of who an American is, and an American has to be a WASP.
The
If
Trump
you
Yep.
matriarch.
if you're
The
not
Trump matriarch,
why
essentially.
was Trump all like, hey, we should get more immigrants from Norway? Because Northwest European Protestants are kind of what they want. But that's again the same kind of thing you saw back then, and it is a really powerful divisive tactic. Something that you can use there, that kind of exclusionary movement, that particular understanding. You're using a word that we have in common, like being an American, right? But you're using it to refer only to a specific subset of Americans, and now you can say, well, Hispanics don't fit, Muslims don't fit.
Yep. And I think that's one of the leading factors. And as we kind of close up, that is a big indicator, especially when we talked about like the Jewish revolt, right? How can we minimize your culture? How can we create assimilation? How can we enslave you? How can we treat you like lesser humans? Americans have done that for so many years. It's not even funny. I mean, for Christ's sake, we came across the water and then started killing Native Americans like
Mhm.
they weren't even people, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Often you hear from like Eurocentric perspectives, like there was no one on North America.
Oh yeah,
There was nothing here. We
Yes.
discovered it and we populated it. Like they didn't even exist. That's
What's that?
frightening.
Yeah.
That great,
You can't
that great
fuck
theory
that
real
much to
estate?
populate it. I'm telling you right now. It does
Yeah.
not exist. You could try.
One of the fun things that like the idea of like the Trump perspective when it comes to some of the points that Liam just made is just that I guarantee you he knows nothing about the history and the historicity of a lot of the prospects and things that he was pushing. these are things that people who may have had a cursory understanding of the historical nature of Nazi and Ku Klux Klan stuff. These are cultural assimilations that have kind of been moving through the system without having a proper identification inside of our system. When we talk about systemic problems, the United States have a bunch of those. Like, in these are the kinds of things that people who are willing to critically look at all of our systems and look at the United States itself and say, there's a problem here, and it's okay to criticize the United States. My assumption is a lot of those perspectives are relatively hard to find when it comes to people that are looking at the multiple variables that you've been mentioning throughout this entire conversation here. Is that, like, these variables and things like that, like, we get lost inside the intent and specifics, and we lose the ability to kind of like see all the different the layers and stuff that I talked about at the very beginning. So
Forest for the trees and all that business. Yeah, you
Yeah.
know, it's hard
That's a
to
mem-
see how all the pieces fit together. Like,
Mhm.
and it's something we're not actually naturally wired for either. Like recognizing, you know, big systems or long-term change. It's just not how we naturally think. You have to really consciously train yourself to recognize these kind of systems. So you can see why a lot of people have a kind of knee-jerk reaction to discussion of big systemic forces. You know, look at the big fight over like critical race theory. Like, they don't really get what it's looking at because it just isn't an immediate part of their lives. They don't see the long-term impact of these things over the whole country, and that's kind of what the scholars are doing. You just talking past each other. But
So
there's a sorry, I was gonna say
no, go ahead.
there's just a quick point. There's an interesting point you made there about people not knowing things, right? And you know, and just sort of like picking up on stuff. It's like it's like the zeitgeist, you know, it's in the air, whatever, you know. Some of that really is the driving factor. Some people really know, like Trump, no, but Steve Bannon, he knows this kind of crap and he knows what to draw on. Bannon has the wrong solutions to a lot of things, but he has actually studied the history of like insurrections and populism and all this kind of stuff, and he's consciously drawing on a whole bunch of stuff, everything from like the Klan to like Leninism, even, you know, like he's influenced by a lot of different stuff. But it's sort of an exception. Most of the people caught up in the whole America First movement have no idea where it really comes from. It's just sort of a long-term cultural osmosis. But this is also where I'm always cautioning people not to associate the insurrection or any of our current instability with Trump himself. Trump is a symptom of much longer term process. Major changes from the 1960s on, like the Goldwater move there, and then Reagan in the 1980s are what made this all possible. Reagan's dog whistles were unbelievably obvious if you know the history, but most people didn't. He could, with a smile, sell apartheid to you, and everyone's like, "Oh, he's not racist," but he's, yes, super.
He was in a movie.
racist.
It's great.
Yeah, it kind of like paved the way for Trumpism and laid out a lot of the things that, where today you got people on the right with a straight face can tell you Trump is not racist, Trump isn't prejudiced. No way. They can do that because Reagan already sold them on the same ideas more effectively with dog whistles. So Trump being a bit more obvious, you can kind of paper over.
Like, in the same breath, they'll tell you that Ben Shapiro has a healthy sexual relationship with his wife.
All right. I'm gonna cut you off there, and we're not gonna go down that road. That's enough, my friend. Ugh. All right. As we wrap it up, we want to thank Liam for joining us tonight. I think it's been a good informational episode. I almost feel like we almost have to do a part three now. Like, we almost have to do a part 3 where we talk about what is the hope, what is our hope. And I think so. I think we're gonna plan that. I do think we'll plan that in a month. I think we're gonna come back and let's talk about what is the hope for democracy, right? Because we know we could see the track of where we're failing. We can see the track of where we've been successful.
Holy shit.
And what we want to do is now say, how can we create course correction as well as create a hope that gives people the ability to want to move? Because we know it's not going to happen very fast. We know that. That's a fact. But what we can do is say, how do we create course correction, and where do we have to make the compromises to ensure that our democracy does not fail, so that in 50 years, when the South is burning up, we work together and we don't all try to, move to Michigan and live in Tanner's neighborhood because I don't want to give up my farms for that. So
Wait,
Or come to Cleveland and live
Wait,
close to the water.
are you kidding? I can't. Really? Come on.
Oh, you can.
I was.
You're
totally-
allowed to come.
I'm gonna
you gotta-
take a whole. I'm gonna move my family and we'll settle up there where it's nice and cool still.
You can. If you do, then you can actually come in studio in my
But I-
jail-like looking house. You could come be in studio.
But I can't take the rest of Southern California with me. Is what you're
Mm-mm.
saying? Most of us have to stay. So
The majority of them got to stay there. You could take. There's a band called MXPX. If they don't live there anymore, but if they did, you could have taken them with you. Devil Driver. You could bring Devil Driver to Michigan too. I'm okay with that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Can I
bring me
bring-
some Devil Driver.
Can I bring?
Oh man,
Bad Religion or No Effects? Yeah.
definitely not.
Aw.
And it's not the I don't know. I don't want to get into the no effects thing.
I just got an email from Scott Stapp. He's lonely and he wants a hug.
Yeah, I'm sure he does, and I'm sure he wants to say some more racist shit and wants to be a piece of shit and fucking fuck. Anyway, you're gonna get me on a tangent. We'll be another 3 hours, and I gotta call my wife. I'm sorry. So,
But talking about what we can do about it is actually a really good idea because I think a lot of people can look at this and get super hopeless, especially
It
when you're
is,
looking
it's
at long-term things because none of this happened quickly. It built up over a long period of time and it will take a long time to get back out of it. But if we don't even start doing the right things, we're never going to get there. It's kind of like the climate change analogy you're making there. If we don't start fixing this stuff, it's never going to get better.
yep. And everybody will be in Michigan. Nobody's going to Ohio, Hannah. Nobody wants to live in that godforsaken state. I'm from Ohio too, folks. Just so y'all know, I was born in Springfield.
When it gets so bad that we actually take Jim Jordan, we tie him to a pole and peel him to tell people not to come anywhere near Ohio, it might be a little bit better. But until
All
that
right.
moment, when it comes to the peeling of Jim Jordan, then we'll see. But
All right. Well, with that being said, anybody else have anything else before we close out?
Nope.
Oh.
I mean, I'm
All
still
right.
here, so
You are still there. You just have video issues. We could tell.
yeah, something like that.
All right. Well, thank you, Liam, for joining us tonight. It was a fun night, and we will plan something. So I'll give Keith the task to kind of get back with you, and we'll get a date set. It'll probably take a month because we should probably do a little bit of research. I mean, this show was not like a 5-minute plan, just so you know. So, we should probably put a little bit of effort into it. So Keith, don't invite him on next week, please.
Crap. It was
I would
the
actually
first thing I
suggest-
was gonna do.
Putting it, I would actually recommend pushing it back. 6 weeks or more, whatever. Like, think about it, and maybe we can all like come in with like a few ideas for how we can make things better, and then kind of like just share
That
them
would
and
be
talk around, kind of like brainstorm. Like we can have like a 4-way brainstorm on how do we fix this crap.
I think that's a good idea. So, with that being said, we're going to close out tonight. Have a good night. Thank you. We'll be back next week, Monday night, 10 p.m. Eastern. Or if you're in our European friends, 200 UTC time, because literally I've spent the last week, actually 2 weeks, podcasting and other things where I have to give UTC time instead of Eastern time because it's a more broader spectrum. But with that being said, have a good night, and we'll see you next week.